largely because of protectionism, a little bit because of technology. That's it. One not often understood point is that to have growing world trade, it's not enough to have improving transportation technology. Transportation technology has to improve faster than the technology of production. There's always a kind of a race between reducing costs by just producing things more cheaply here versus reducing costs by bringing stuff from abroad from countries that have lower costs of production. And as it turns out, for much of the 20th century, transportation technology was fairly static, whereas manufacturing was continuing to advance. You'll see why I'm mentioning that point in a few minutes. But in any case, what we saw was that world trade followed a great wave, a great increase in the late 19th and early 20th century, a great recessional, a backwards movement in world trade for 40 years, a recovery up to those pre-World War I levels by 1980 or so, and then this hyperglobalization that took place after 1990 or so. There are increasing reasons to believe that dramatic increase in world trade that we saw over a period of a little over 20 years was a one-time event, that it is not, in fact, something that you can count on to continue forever. You can see that in the numbers. World trade as a share of world GDP, it dropped during the recession and came back afterwards, but it has not resumed its upward march. World trade has been roughly static now for more than a decade as a share of world GDP. It looks like a plateau, not a downward turn, but a plateau. And if we ask why is that the case, the answer probably is that the technological opportunities were a one-time event. They were provided opportunities. Business learned to exploit those opportunities, but once you get there, you've gotten there. So we saw a tremendous increase in offshoring of production, tremendous increase in outsourcing to distant locations. By around 2010, we started to hear stories, see anecdotes, and a little bit of data suggesting that at least some manufacturing was discovering that it had gone a little too far in that direction. That even with very low transport costs, the logistical issues involved in shipping a good back and forth across the Pacific a few times in the course of production are not optimal. That it makes sense to reshore some production closer to markets. As you can see, some of that happening. In the United States, there's been this question, we've been seeing generally weak growth in wages across the board, except for a few skill categories where there has been clearly a very tight labor market for skilled workers with particular skills. And you ask, which are those skill categories? And they're not what you think. It's not actually that we're seeing big wage increases for software engineers. What we're actually seeing is big increases in wages for sewing machine operators. Because it turns out that at least some of the apparel industry has decided that it makes more sense to produce close to markets. And at this point in the United States, there's nobody left who knows how to sew clothing together. So we're kind of short on those sorts of people. And that's an indication. Yeah, it's a trivial story from the point of view of the economy as a whole, but I think it's an indicator that we're looking at a situation where this great increase in globalization that we saw may have reached its limits. Doesn't mean a big downturn in world trade, but it does mean that there's this great wave that was driving a lot of change in the world economy has probably crested. Has probably reached its limit. with one big exception, which we'll get to in a minute. So here we are, and we're looking at the story now. And I think I should say that limits of globalization, that is a concern for some economies. It may be a concern for India at a certain point. Again, I'll get there in a few minutes. But it does mean that, to a certain extent, as new countries try to enter this sphere, they are going to be competing over a somewhat limited pool of business. It's a far bigger pool of business than we ever imagined possible. We used to think that labor-intensive exports were basically apparel and nothing much else. Now we know that there are labor-intensive stages of production for many goods, and so there's a lot of stuff that's available. But if I were thinking about the future for Vietnam or Bangladesh, or possibly as some of the sub-Saharan African nations start to break in, I would be at least a little bit concerned that they missed the moment of the explosion of globalization. And so there's a little bit of a concern there. That's an important issue, but not at least so far yet, a very India-specific issue. But that then brings me to the Indian prospects. So let me give you 3 reasons for being optimistic. I think I'm obliged, simply by the title of the summit, to be optimistic here. So let me give you, but I actually am mostly, with some qualifications, quite optimistic about India's prospects. I think we're going to be hearing a lot more, and I think over time, when the world thinks about rising powers, it will be shifting its focus increasingly to India, at least a little bit away from China, which has been the lead story so far. The first one is people, both numbers and qualifications. So one of the panelists yesterday said India has a lot of smart people, and it does. There's clearly a cultural reservoir of creativity, entrepreneurship, on a level that I think back in the bad old days of slow Indian growth, no one could have imagined, but that's clearly there. And look, the widespread fluency in English is an important thing, even as the United States gradually loses its preeminent status. Nonetheless, English is the language of global commerce, and that's got to matter. But also, there's just plain numbers. If you try to think about national economic destinies, it matters a lot how many people of working age you have. If we're trying to analyze, we talk now, there was a time, I'm old enough to remember it, when Japan was about to become the world's leading economic superpower, which obviously never did happen. And it didn't happen for a couple of reasons. One was that the Japanese rapid productivity growth slowed down, that Japanese technological progress didn't stop, but no longer seemed to be unstoppable. But the biggest reason why Japan has receded on the world stage is simply demography. Japan, with very low fertility rates, cultural aversion to immigration. Japan has a working age population which is now shrinking at about 1.5% a year. And so even if you actually adjust for that, Japan's economic performance the past 20 years doesn't look too bad. But it's a declining factor on the world scene simply because there aren't enough Japanese. Believe it or not, China is starting to look a little bit like that. China's working age population appears to have just about peaked now and will be headed downwards in future. And that's a legacy of the one-child policy, various other factors. But China is not going to continue, it cannot continue to grow at the pace it did simply because of population. Plus, I would say in the case of China, a lot of their growth came from taking people from a backwards agricultural sector and moving them into the modern urban sector, and that process has probably reached its limits. So China has reached that point. India doesn't look at all like that. India's working age population is projected to grow substantially. It will substantially exceed China's working age population in just a few years, and will continue growing for quite some time, which is potentially a source of a lot of economic growth. One good way to have an economic superpower is to have a lot of people working productively, and India certainly has a lot of people. So that's a very, very important possibility. Of course, you have to find jobs for those people, and that's going to be one of the issues that we need to worry about a little bit. Come to that in a bit. But assuming that that can work, India has the demography is on India's side in terms of its future economic role in the world. Second source of optimism is simply that India is still quite poor, still quite far behind the technological cutting edge, which is not a good thing, but means that the opportunity for catch-up is still there. I mean, you cannot expect to have the kind of growth that emerging Asia has had if you're already at the technological frontier, which is why Japan, it can no longer be a country of rapid growth. But India is still, so much of India is still far behind, and of course, particularly if we look at rural areas. I was struck again by the Prime Minister's speech talking about rural electrification. That's not, believe it or not, that's not ancient history even in wealthy countries. If we go back to the United States, one of the major projects of Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal in the 1930s, was rural electrification. Because in the 1930s, most of rural America did not have electric power. So we're now talking about, but the point is that you have the opportunity now to bring hundreds of millions of people into the modern world, and that in turn means that there's a tremendous source of growth, potential at least, that is not available for countries that have already done that. So that's a source of forward motion. The third source of optimism is the distinctiveness of India's role in global trade. As I said, India, it's completely unique and unprecedented to be as much of a service exporter